what's going on? Welcome. I hope everything's going well. Hope you're doing good. MPC One, record player. What else do we need? Let's make a beat. I found a super nice Rhodes sample on this Italian soundtrack record, so I'm thinking we can make a beat out of it. Because the sample is just Rhodes, it's definitely going to give us some really chill vibes, and I think we're going to be able to make something really laid back and cool with it. The other thing I love about Rhodes samples is because they're so open, it gives us a lot of opportunity to add ourselves into the beat. So we'll make sure that we can do whatever we want with the drums, whatever we want with the bass, and have that cut through a little bit. But let's record it into the MPC, chop it up, and then we'll get moving on this. Let's do it. As I mentioned, this is a Rhodes sample, and it's kind of the intro to the track, so it's a little bit free time. There's no percussion, and because of that, I didn't just chop on every beat. I instead took certain runs or certain chords that sounded really nice and chopped it at those points. And I'll actually just bring up the chop so you can see. All the samples are different lengths. It's just sort of based on what I heard and where I thought there'd be some nice chords and notes. So here's a little sample of what we've got. Really moody, it's got a lot of space, a lot of air to it, and for that reason, I think it's going to make a pretty sick beat. And if this isn't your first time here, you probably know I really like chopping up Italian soundtrack records. This one is no exception. There's a ton of samples on here. They're not always the easiest to find, but anytime I see them, especially with certain names, certain composers, I buy them every time. This was from a trip that I went to in Houston, so shout out to Cactus Records. If you're ever in the Houston area, stop by there. They had a really good selection, great prices. I definitely recommend it. And also, if this isn't your first time here, you probably know that I'm going to slow this sample down because that's what I really like to do. So let's go to the sample edit. I'll turn this down a couple semitones. Yeah, I like that a lot. When it comes to Rhodes samples and these sort of really open samples with no percussion, I like turning the tuning down a lot of the time because I just find that moodiness and air that we have from the sample gets enhanced from stretching out the sample. So first things first, let's just try to come up with a sample chop pattern. The other thing that's nice with not chopping to the beats in the sample and rather just chopping on sounds that we like, it really opens up what you can do tempo wise. Because we're not stuck to the beat of the sample or the BPM of the sample, we can slow down the sample, speed it up, but it won't necessarily affect the speed of the chops that we do, as long as we don't speed it up to the point where those samples are so short that we'll have to kind of play a sample constantly. Sorry, didn't mean to hit that. So let's mess around a little bit. I'll probably be working in somewhere in the 80s in terms of BPM, but I'll just mess around on the pad, see what we can come up with. Let's do it. Yep. That's it. Let's do it. So let's start adding some drums to this beat. I've been mentioning a lot this sort of space and air that we have from the sample. I think we should try to take advantage of that and sort of enhance that with our drums. So I'm going to be using this hi-hat to start. As you can hear, it's got a lot of reverb, a lot of tail to it, and I think especially once we start sort of compressing this beat, all those things are going to be brought up with that. So I'll put that on 16 levels of velocity. A lot of times when we use 16 velocity for the hi-hat pattern, especially when it's just like an eighth note pattern, 1 and 2 and 3. The quarter note beats will be the higher velocity, and then the off beats will be the lower velocity, so it'll be something like this. That's a really common pattern to do. One thing I like to do sometimes, especially when the drums are going to be sort of more predominant, is have the lower velocity on the quarter notes, and then on the off beats do the higher, so it would sound like this. The one nice thing that does is it gives it even more of that compressed sound that I was talking about, because the kick and snares are often on those quarter note grid marks. They often end up aligning on there, and so those off beats, we're going to have that louder hi-hat. So we'll see how that kind of plays out in practice, but let's lay it down. I'll turn off the time correction on this, and we'll just record that simple pattern. Let's do it. So now that we have those hi-hats recorded, let's add in some snare to this. And with these drum prominent beats, the snare is often really important in terms of really nailing down exactly what you want that to sound like. What that means a lot of the time is you should really be layering your snares. This is going to be the first layer that I'm using. I like that it has a bit of that reverb, it has a good sound to it. And also for this first layer, I'm going to turn the time correction back on. So I'll record that first snare sound, and then we can keep working on the drums, layering sounds, and really getting that sound we want. Let's do it. So now to add some depth to that snare that we already recorded, I'm going to use this rim shot. As you can hear, a lot of reverb I put on there, a lot of tail to it, but because it's such a softer sound, it's not going to be right at the forefront of the snare hits. It's really going to get sort of pushed back by the first snare that we recorded. One thing I like to do as well when I'm layering snares is the layered sound that I add on, I usually don't quantize. What that allows for is the way that the two layers line up is not going to be the exact same on any one of the snare hits. Although it's not something that stands out when you're listening to the track, if you listen for it, you'll notice that it gives it a little bit more of a live sound, because if you're playing a real snare, it's not going to sound the exact same every single time. So giving these little bits of different alignment on those two layers, I find is a good way to just give it a little bit more of a loose sound. So I'll turn off quantization, add on that snare layer. Let's see how it sounds. Let's do it. And just so you can get a really good idea of what that layering sounded like with the quantization on the first layer and off on the second, I'm just going to solo the drums and listen to the snares and how they sound a little bit different on each of the hits in the drum pattern. You could hear on the first hit, they almost lined up perfectly, it sounded like to me. The second hit, you could hear that the layer came in a little bit earlier, so you get almost this flam sound. Listen to that closely. And it just gives you this really cool variation that comes pretty easily when you just quantize the first part, unquantize the second. Definitely try that out if you're trying to get more of that live sound. But to finish up these drums, let's add in a kick pattern. I think it's going to put our drums in a pretty good spot. Let's do it. Okay, I'm loving where this beat's at so far, and we'll definitely want to add some bass to this, and I have an idea of what kind of bass we should use. But before we record the bass, I want to just make another pattern with the sample chop. That way we'll have another variation in the beat that we can use. So I'm just going to copy the entire sequence onto a new sequence. Then we can just take out the sample chop, use the drums again, although sometimes I would re-record everything just so you have a little bit of variation. I don't want to do that today. Let's just copy it. In terms of the sample pattern, I found this really nice pad from the sample chop. It sounds really dreamy. still going. It has this really nice dreamy sound, shimmery sound, and I think really we can use that as the basis of the entire sequence. I think that sequence is going to be sick if we add some layers of another sample, so we'll keep that in mind. But let's lay down some bass on this track. One thing I did a video on in a neo soul video, which you can check out here, is I really love the sound of Rhodes and the bass being played by a synth. I think just sort of the cleanness of the Rhodes juxtaposes really well with the grunginess you can get out of a synth if you have sort of this overdriven sound. Even though both instruments are electronic, I find a synth sounds a little bit more computerized. So having that computerized bass on top of this natural sounding Rhodes piano gives you this really cool sound. So rather than pulling out one of the synths right now, I'm just going to use a synth bass note that I already have in here, which you can get from my sample pack. Shameless plug, check it out right here. It's free. Go ahead and download it if you like the sound. But yeah, if you're working with a Rhodes sample or even your own Rhodes playing, I suggest trying some synth bass and just see if you like the way that works out. I also don't want the bass to overpower the sample too much, so I'll probably do a bit of a stabby pattern rather than long notes. I just want to make sure that we still leave some space in the beat and it's not being completely overtaken by these super low frequencies. So after messing around with the bass a little bit, I actually don't want to do a stabby pattern because I find it's actually drawing my ear more than just playing long notes. So I'm just going to keep it really simple, play like 2 notes in this pattern, and I think it's going to allow us to keep the life in the sample chop that we had and not take away from it with an intricate pattern. So let's do that. I think this beat's in a really good spot. I'm liking the vibe we're getting from it. I think we can layer another sample on top of this because we have so much space to play, and then we can really even put more of a stamp on this beat. So let's lay down a little saxophone part on top of this so we'll have even more sequences to go through and have a more fulsome beat. The one thing I just want to mention really quick that I don't think I've mentioned before is a lot of times when I have the sample chop, drums programmed, I will oftentimes record bass and add layers to beats in Ableton rather than on the MPC. That's just because when it comes to working with MIDI, when it comes to adding one-off things into beats, I find it's a little bit easier to do in a DAW because you don't have to make a new sequence for every single one that you're making. That being said, I still love doing those things on the MPC, but just wanted to mention that. So let's add some layers onto this beat. We'll keep it moving and get a more fulsome beat out of this. Here's what the saxophone sample sounds like. One sort of a pickup run, and then we have the resolution. For the second sequence we did, it was this one, just as a reminder. It has so much open space. I want to do that delay trick that I've talked about a few times, so I'm going to take this chop, just that really short chop, put that on the 16 levels of velocity, and then we can play that as sort of a controlled delay through the velocity pads. I think that's going to sound really cool with the openness that we have in that sequence. Let's lay it down. And with that, I think that wraps it up for this beat. I think we ended up with something pretty sweet with the Rhodes sample. By the way, if you figure out where this sample's from, put it in the comments. I'll tell you if you're right. But But I hope you enjoyed hanging out and making this beat. I know I did, and I hope you're having a lot of fun making music. If you did like the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this. Love you so much. Thank you for hanging out. Peace.